Hi guys, it's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, and we are here today to do a commentary that I've been wanting to do for a long time. It's going to be very, very, very fun. So just get ready for your head to explode with information. We're going to be talking today about Dune and the various adaptations. All of you know, of course, that Denis Villeneuve's film is coming out shortly, I think in October, and it's looking good, and some people really love it, and hopefully it will be great. We really all want it to be great. We need a terrific, epic science fiction movie, and he's a very good candidate as the director of that project. But Dune has a really, really interesting backstory, and so let's cover it. Some of the stuff you will know, some of it you probably won't know, and I'm going to try and put all the pieces together, and then I'm going to show you an incredibly cool version of Dune in its entirety. So we'll see where this all leads. We'll see what happens. Tell your friends, spread the word. So here we go. A big part of the problem in adapting Dune over the many decades since the book first came out in 1965 was the challenge between television and movies, the tension between them as delivery media of content. Because back in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, a movie was one very specific thing and a TV series was another very specific thing. And the problem with this was that if you want to do something big budget, which had a huge amount of money for visual effects, for sets, to create a universe, generally you needed a motion picture, because you could do motion pictures. Now they're of course $200 million and up. Back then, adjusted for inflation, they were similar things. It might be $40 million or $80 million or ultimately $100 million. And a TV series, you might have $1 million an episode, $2 million an episode. So you're talking about a much lower budget per hour to present a science fiction universe. And as a result, TV often looked a bit threadbare in terms of production. Just look at the original Star Trek series and compare that with the Star Trek movies. A much, much bigger budget for those. So Dune, of course, needed a big budget. But on the other hand, the length, because movies could be 2 hours. If they went much beyond 2 hours, they were very problematical for the theaters showing them, because the theaters showing them, their profits would be tied to how many times they could show the movie. Now, when I was a kid, you could stay at a movie theater as long as you liked. So, for instance, I would pay 25 cents at the Maralta or 50 cents at the Culver Theater, and if there was a movie I liked, I could just watch it I could sit through the whole day, and just watch it over and over again. Sometime after that, theater owners got wise, and they would clear out the audience after every showing, and you'd have to buy another ticket to see it again. So they wouldn't want movies that were much longer than 2 hours, because that would limit the number of times they could show them per day, and thus cut into their potential profits. So let's start at the beginning with Dune, and we'll walk through why that made adaptation a big problem until the modern era. So here we go. But also, just in terms of movies, in terms of that running length problem, this was dogging many productions for many decades, going back all the way to the silent films. Erich von Stroheim did a film called Greed that was an adaptation of a novel, and its running time was 10 hours, and the studio cut it down to 2, basically gutting it, and threw out the footage. The rest of the footage. Now, fortunately, on a great film like Metropolis, they recently found, almost an hour of added material, and it greatly enhances the film. But that was from a bootleg copy that someone had saved, and 80 years later it was discovered. Amazing, amazing, amazing. But even on Magnificent Ambersons, a film that Orson Welles directed after Citizen Kane, they had to cut it down and shoot a different ending and take it away from Orson Welles. And again, it's one of the great losses of one of the greatest movies ever made, because we'll never see his version because they threw out the footage. So this has been a problem with films since the beginning. And so then let's move along. So science fiction is continuing through the 20th century, and you're getting Heinlein and Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, many guys, Ray Bradbury, rising to the top echelon of science fiction. Now, there was one guy who came out of the military, and he was struggling in the 50s and 60s to make a living as a writer, and he was not one of these top guys. He was not one of these legends of science fiction. He was just trying to get a foothold and make a living and get by and find his way of punching through to fame and fortune. And his name was Frank Herbert, and this is a book he wrote in the 50s. It was published in hardcover as The Dragon in the Sea, and it was published in paperback as 21st Century Sub. And I actually really like this cover, and my mom's friend Joe Katzenberger had this copy on his shelves when I was a kid, and I lusted after it, and finally as an adult I could get a copy. So, but Frank Herbert, you know, if you'd gone back to the 60s or the late 50s, the early 60s or late 50s, and said, who are the top science fiction writers, his name would not have been in the mix. He was just kind of like one of the guys like Lawrence Janifer, or, you know, a whole bunch of guys who were just kind of like toilers in the field. Murray Leinster was another one of those, a little more prolific. But so, okay. But then he got a great idea. Now, most science fiction of that period, when they were speculating and postulating future societies or future empires, stellar empires, galactic empires, they were drawing upon the history of the West, of Western civilization. And so you might get an extrapolation of Rome or Alexander the Great or ancient Egypt, but you wouldn't get, but the reading public by and large was not aware of other cultures, and particularly as extrapolated in science fiction. There were exceptions to this, like Cordwainer Smith with China and things like that, but rare, very rare, very few and far between. So what Frank Herbert came up with was the idea of taking Arab culture and Arab mythology and utilizing that to speculate a future. And so basically he came up with Dune. And the idea was there's a planet, it's a desert planet, much like the desert parts of our world, and there was a culture there that prized water extremely highly, that were somewhat like Bedouins, where they were very elusive. They lived in the desert. They knew the desert. They could survive where others couldn't. And then he also took from the Muslim litany words like jihad and Mahdi. Now, I knew about all this stuff because I was familiar, even as a kid, with historical events like Chinese Gordon in Khartoum, where the Mahdi, someone who purported to be the Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah, essentially took on Chinese Gordon, a very famous British military guy, and defeated him. But that Mahdi died shortly after that, so he did not continue with his jihad that he intended to, basically create the caliphate that the guys like Islamic Jihad talk about all the time. So and other extreme groups. But I knew about that history. So when I read Dune, I was aware of what Frank Herbert was referencing in creating this amazing world that he extrapolated. So here's a little history about that. So Frank Herbert comes up with the idea of this future intergalactic, interstellar empire that's got different houses that are running different worlds. So you have the Emperor running it all, and then you have the Atreides family and the Harkonnens, and so forth, and the Spacing Guild. Really interesting stuff. And Dune, Arrakis. And so he wrote it first. It was serialized in Analog. It came out initially in 1963 in Analog magazine, which at that point was like this big kind of magazine size. It wasn't a digest at that point. And John Schoner was the cover artist. He was very, very good, and he really captured that world. And and it came out, and it was well received, but not a barn burner by any means. It wasn't what everyone was talking about. And so then Frank Herbert tried to sell the book, and every major publisher, probably even minor ones, rejected it. So what was he to do? And again, this is just a guy. He's not famous at this point. He's not, the Frank Herbert that we would all come to know later. The sort of the big kind of heavyset, kind of Moses kind of guy with a big beard. Not that guy at all. So he comes up with an inspiration. There is a publisher named Chilton, and they publish auto repair manuals, car repair manuals. So if you've got your Rambler and you want to fix it, you buy their repair book and you go through it. This is before the internet, so you couldn't just Google something. And they only publish car repair manuals. But he submits Dune to them, and they buy it. And this is first edition of Dune, published by Chilton. And you can see, if you look really closely there, it says Chilton on the bottom. Don't know if you can see that, but this is, and on the back it has a map, and you know, so and then on the front it has this cool cover painted by John Schoner, who was doing the covers for Dune in Astounding, and the book was, it caught fire. It caught fire. And it won the Hugo for Best Novel, it won the Nebula for Best Novel, the 2 top awards, and Frank Herbert, and it was a huge bestseller. And the timing was extremely good because it was 1965, the hippies were just coming into prominence, and the counterculture, and this was a book that was about a young man, a teenager, who rises to become a messianic figure and a leader. And it's filled with adventure and battle and mysticism, and people take drugs and have higher consciousness. It was perfect for the young readers, the young science fiction readers of that period, and so it became one of the great classics of science fiction. Now, and Frank Herbert became one of the great science fiction writers. And here is the American paperback of Dune. And that, again, has a painting by John Schoner, the same one who did the illustrations from analog to the hardcover to the softcover, because he was basically, you know, right on the money in terms of what Dune looked like and should look like, and the tone of it. So, and then, of course, they did the British edition, which has the Fremen with the spice eyes, and, you know, clearly this person really knew what the book was talking about, and it has this very cool back cover with the different accoutrements of Dune, including a skull there, if you notice. Now, an interesting side note is that during this period, often British science fiction paperbacks and American science fiction paperbacks would share covers, but not necessarily on the same book. So this lovely cover was used on an American book, but not of Dune. It was used on The 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which, of course, these visual elements have nothing to do with at all. And I don't know what Philip K. Dick thought of that. It's a very good book, but this is obviously not the the same story. And so they tried to explain it in the alien world and blah blah blah, talking about Palmer Eldritch. But you know, anyone who's read Dune knows what this is illustrating. So. Okay, so Dune was a huge hit. It's off and running, and naturally, very soon, there would be interest to make it into a movie. Now, as we said before, you know, movies were considered like 2 hours. If they went over 2 hours, it was a bit of a problem. TV shows, their problem, beyond lower budgets, was that because of the syndication, back then, when you had 3 networks and syndication, TV episodes could not be aired in any specific order. So in other words, when they went into syndication, whatever local channel was running them would run them in whatever order. And so that's why in, for instance, the original Star Trek, every episode, you could shuffle them to almost any order and it would still be the same. So in other words, one week on City on the Edge of Forever, Kirk loses the love of his life. Next week, not even talking about her, he's not even depressed, he finds another girl on another planet, and so on, because they would be shown in whatever order. And so you couldn't tell a story that grew and arced. And so what that meant was that you would have a lower budget in television and 1 hour stories that began and ended within the hour. Now, it started to change a little bit in the late 60s, early 70s, when you started to get miniseries. Now, miniseries would be often 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever, and they would run in 2 hour blocks, often on successive nights, and or in successive weeks. And that's how you got a miniseries like Roots that would just, you know, take the world by storm and could tell a big story that would be novel length. And so you started getting these with things like Captains and the Kings. They were usually often adaptations of books, popular fiction, but not science fiction, because again, the budgets were low to a point where doing world building really wasn't in the cards, and visual effects were expensive and difficult during that period. We're talking the 70s into the early 80s. And so that was a limitation within the form. But you started at least getting multi-hour stories that could tell a longer story, a novel-length story. Then another curveball, another thing that changed the definition of a movie and the definition of a TV show was when home video came out, particularly DVDs, because then people would buy the entire season or the entire series, and if it told a story over a season or over the series, people could binge watch it, and it became a selling point for the home video, for the ancillary market, that you might have seen it on TV, but every week you'd have to wait a week to see the next installment, and it would take years to see what the larger story was. And also with DVD, the advent of DVD, you could have longer versions of movies, director's cut of Aliens, or director's cut of The Abyss, or whatever, and that became a selling plus as well. So they started looking at longer versions of a movie that would be on the home video release and also the network TV release, as well as the miniseries starting to be more regular TV shows were doing arcing stories. And it was all related to economics, but what was starting to happen was that the feature film running length started to dovetail with TV series running lengths, because also over the course of the last few decades, whereas TV series might run, years ago, some of them would be 39 episodes a year, then it might be 26, then 22. Now, of course, it's 13 episodes for a season of a series, or even 10, or even 8. And so we're starting to get to emerging, and particularly as the studios and the networks became the same corporate entity, something that used to be illegal during the 60s into the 70s, when Reagan came to power, all of that was swept aside, and you could have a studio and a network being owned by the same entity. And as a result, they would then see a way of maximizing profits on any given property, where it would be both film and TV, and it would basically be deliverable content through various delivery windows. And that's what we're seeing now. So this is just an explanation of how you could have a longer story. Also, with Star Wars succeeding, prior to Star Wars, it was pretty much a given that the first film, if it was a success, they'd make sequels, but those would be lower budgets and lower quality as they went on. So if you look at a movie like The Thin Man, the adaptation of the Dashiell Hammett novel, first one's really good, and then they go down in quality. So, but with Star Wars and even Star Trek, particularly Star Wars, though, you would have a bigger budget and a higher quality as the sequels went on, higher production quality. And so this also started to change the way science fiction was made. So now we get back to Dune, and the novel has come out. It's been a huge success, and obviously it's on too big a scale to be a TV show in the late 60s, early 70s, but there's possibilities for features. So Arthur P. Jacobs in 1972 he had produced Planet of the Apes, and he saw Dune as the next big science fiction project he would do, so he optioned it. And he had worked with David Lean before, Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, and so he brought David Lean, one of the great directors of cinema, aboard. And David Lean initially brought aboard his screenwriter, Robert Bolt, and that was terrific. So they started working on their adaptation of Dune, Arthur P. Jacobs, David Lean, and Robert Bolt. And if you look at Lawrence of Arabia and think of what that might have been if it were science fiction, that I think gives you an idea of what David Lean's Dune might have been. It probably would have been a very interesting and very good movie. But ultimately they brought another screenwriter aboard, but sadly a year after, as it was still in development, Arthur P. Jacobs died. And so as a result, the whole thing with David Lean fell apart, and the rights reverted, and they were bought by a European consortium that then brought aboard Alejandro Jodorowsky. Now that was a very interesting choice, and a very different choice from David Lean. It couldn't have been more different, because Jodorowsky had come out of the world of theater, and he spoke Spanish, and he was very much sort of a counterculture kind of director. He had done very trippy kind of movies, El Topo, The Magic Mountain, so forth, and or The Holy Mountain, whatever it was called. But he was known for very odd and films that really pushed the envelope. So he comes aboard Dune. It's 1974, and the producers move him to Paris, and he basically writes. They basically said, you can do whatever you want, and he said, well, I wonder what I should do. And a friend of his said, Dune is a great novel, you should do Dune. He hadn't read it, but he said, okay, I'll do Dune. So, so they're off and running. Now, this movie never got made, but there's a terrific documentary of it called Jodorowsky's Dune, which I very, very highly recommend. It's a terrific, terrific documentary because this is the greatest unmade film of our modern times, and it is also, it basically had a ripple effect that led to virtually all the major science fiction movies of the 80s and 90s into the current day. So let's talk about this for a moment. Okay, so Jodorowsky decides that this thing is going to be a world-changing movie, that it is going to be hugely informative and going to change the young people of the world. So he gets together an amazing design team. Now in 1974, he hires an artist who had only been in galleries, had never been in movies, H.R. Giger, to design everything relating to the villain, the Baron Harkonnen. And he hires Mobius, Jean Giraud, who was a comic book artist, a graphic novel artist working under the name Mobius, to design a lot of the Paul Atreides human stuff, a lot of the good guy stuff, the characters. And he hires a British artist named Chris Foss to design the spaceships. And so he's the first one to ever look toward hiring brilliant science fiction artists to come together and design different aspects of the movie for different cultures. And it was a brilliant, brilliant idea. And then he brings aboard Dan O'Bannon to do the visual effects. Now, Dan O'Bannon had come out of college. He'd done a very cool comedy science fiction film called Dark Star that he was a college student with John Carpenter. The two of them collaborated to make this movie. O'Bannon starred in it. They wrote it. John Carpenter directed it. It was basically the start of both of their careers. And Dan O'Bannon, but basically Jodorowsky had met with Doug Trumbull, who would come off 2001, A Space Odyssey, and was a great, great visual effects guy. Later he'd do Blade Runner. And they really didn't see eye to eye. So he hired Dan O'Bannon. Dan O'Bannon was a young guy, just out of college, kind of a trippy guy, hippie guy kind of guy. And now he had gotten to know a political cartoonist. Stick with me, guys. He had gotten to know a political cartoonist who was drawing for the Free Press, an LA kind of hippie counterculture paper. And he was doing political cartoons. And the fun thing about his political cartoons were that there'd be aliens in them and spaceships and all this robots, all this science fiction stuff, and they would look great. And so Dan O'Bannon got to know this guy. His name was Ron Cobb. Ron Cobb had actually tried to start a business to do science fiction movie design in the 50s, and no one had hired him. And so he had put his skills elsewhere. But he got to know Dan O'Bannon, and Dan O'Bannon was stuck for a design of the spaceship in Dark Star. So Cobb, on a napkin, very famously drew the design of the ship and said, here you go. And then he later did much more formal blueprints of it and the exterior of the ship. And my friend Greg Jean built the model, which I've seen in person. It's really cool. And it was a really good looking spaceship. And so Jodorowsky had seen that, and he brought aboard Dan O'Bannon. And Dan O'Bannon had hired Ron Cobb around this time to paint 10 concept paintings to sell a screenplay he was trying to sell called Alien. But it hadn't sold yet. But I saw those 10 paintings in Cobb's apartment when I met him when I was 16. They were amazing. But so he said to Jodorowsky, well, you should hire this Ron Cobb guy. So everyone goes off to Paris to work on all of this stuff. And it's an amazing, incredible art design team between Chris Foss, Mobius, Dan O'Bannon, Ron Cobb, H.R. Giger. Phenomenal. So Jodorowsky is up and running, and he does something remarkable that is not generally done during that period, which is he has Mobius storyboard the entire film, as well as doing the character designs. And these are amazing, beautiful storyboards. And so Jodorowsky is sort of a genius of science fiction without having done a science fiction movie. And but he's got this astonishing design team, and for many years, in that documentary, he shows this book, yay thick and yay wide, of all the artwork, but it's never been published. But someone took photographs of a lot of those storyboards and a lot of those illustrations, put them online, so you can see them online now. And someday someone should publish that book, and someday someone should take those storyboards and do what we call an animatic, an animated storyboard like we've done on Space Command, to dramatize that story, because it's a very interesting story. So Jodorowsky starts casting his movie. It's not shooting yet, but he casts, as the Emperor, he casts Salvador Dali, and Dali wanted $100,000 an hour, and Jodorowsky figures out how he can shoot all of Dali's role in an hour. So he says yes. And Dali, of course, was the great surrealist painter. What Jodorowsky's thinking about is a cast that will just, everyone will be talking about, because it's such an unusual cast. But Salvador Dali will play the Emperor. Mick Jagger will play the role of the young villain, Fade, who's a Harkonnen. And of course, Mick Jagger was at the height of his powers in 1974, incredibly charismatic, incredibly sexual and physical and visceral and cool looking. For the Baron Harkonnen, who's this heavyset guy who's on these levitating things, he hired Orson Welles, another good choice. And David Carradine was going to be in it as well. And for Paul Atreides, for the hero, he hired his son, who was a very handsome young man, Jodorowsky's son, and he starts training martial arts, exercise. He starts training rigorously day after day after day after month to get in shape, physical shape, to play Paul, who's this messianic teenage figure. He also reaches out to Pink Floyd to do the score. But he encounters a problem that basically everyone who's worked on a movie adaptation of Dune encounters, which is they say to him, how long will this movie be? He wrote the script at the beginning of all this process. And he says, well, I don't know. It might be 10 hours, it might be 12 hours, because he understands that it's a big book, that to try and fit it in standard 2 hours is not a good idea. And at that point, when he says 10 or 12 hours, everyone freaks out, other than him. And the financing collapses and the movie goes away. He's that's the end of that. It all disintegrates, because movies are so difficult to put together and such a production that it's really hard to put them together. And once something starts to unravel, the whole thing can collapse like a house of cards, and that's that. So it's quite a challenge. But Jodorowsky, he now really loved science fiction, and he decided that all of the things he had put into this effort were not going to go without some creative outcome. And so he then collaborated with Mobius, Jean Giraud, to do the Incal, which was a series of graphic novels with aliens and all sorts of stuff. And he then also went on to do the Metahumans with another artist. And so he's done many, many, many science fiction stories. And so you can seek those out and read them and get a sense of what Dune might have been like in terms of scope, in terms of scale, in terms of design. And Mobius, of course, was one of the great artists of comic books and graphic novels and science fiction. But although the movie doesn't get made, the influence of how it was being made has a huge, tremendous ripple effect. So the next person to acquire, there's several things happen at once. So in 1976, Dino De Laurentiis acquires Dune as a property. Now, interestingly enough, the whole art team, other than Chris Foss and Mobius, but Chris Foss is still part of that whole team, all of that team kind of go home. And most of them, like Ron Cobb and Dan O'Bannon, many of them go to LA. Now, by around 1977, 78, Alien had sold. And Ridley Scott had come aboard. He'd done a movie called The Duelist that was very visual, a historical film. And he came out of commercials. He directed a ton of commercials. And he was going to do Tristan and Isolde as his next movie, sort of this romance period film. And then he saw Star Wars, and he had seen 2001, and he just realized that he needed to do a science fiction movie. He would be so outdated and so beside the point that he couldn't do Tristan and Isolde. He would have to do a science fiction movie. So he read Alien and loved it. And he had a strong art background. And so he started storyboarding the entire movie. And when they saw his storyboards, they doubled the budget. It was amazing. And but because Dan O'Bannon's the writer on Alien, he says to Ridley Scott, hey, I've just been working on Dune in Paris for Jodorowsky, and you got to check out this art team that we assembled. And he looks at the art team of Giger and Ron Cobb and Mobius and Chris Foss, and he's just blown away. And he hires them all. He hires Giger to do the monster, and on all the alien stuff, the alien ship. He hires Ron Cobb to design a lot of the human ship, interior and exteriors. He hires Chris Foss to do some ship designs. He hires Mobius to design the spacesuits of the humans. It's a phenomenal design team. And it, of course, makes Alien the masterpiece that it is. And everyone looks at it and says, wow, designing the alien aesthetic with one artist and the human aesthetic with other ones is a great idea, and it works like a charm, and Alien is a huge hit. So by this time, 1979, when the movie comes out, Dino De Laurentiis is looking for a guy to direct Dune. So he hires Ridley Scott. So you see how this all comes around. It's an amazing story. And so Ridley Scott starts working on it. But in 1980, his older brother dies. His older brother Frank dies unexpectedly of cancer, and Ridley Scott is just devastated by this, and he realizes he cannot give his full attention to the years of work Dune will take, and he, regretfully exits the project. And all of the design work he put in, all the script work that was put in, all that goes out the window. So now Dino De Laurentiis has a problem, which is who's going to direct Dune. Now, De Laurentiis and his daughter, Raffaella De Laurentiis, they were a very successful family of Italian producers, movie producers, and they'd done tons and tons and tons of films. And Dino De Laurentiis would do the weird Jessica Lange King Kong with the giant King Kong that didn't work, so Rick Baker had to jump in and play Kong in a gorilla suit. But that's another story for another time. But De Laurentiis is the old-fashioned, big personality kind of movie producer, but Italian. And he comes from the Italian movie-making tradition, which is a very different one from the American. So now at that time, a very odd director had been emerging. He did an indie film called Eraserhead that was very successful and very peculiar. And then he did his first big studio film, and that was The Elephant Man, starring John Hurt, who would also be, of course, in Alien prior to that. And the Elephant Man was a huge success, particularly critically. It was in black and white. It had a wonderful cast, and the visual design elements of grotesquerie fit this director perfectly. And his name was David Lynch. And so he was brought on. Now, oddly enough, same as Jodorowsky, he hadn't read the book, and he wasn't a fan of science fiction. But he comes aboard because everyone's doing science fiction films that period. They were the big money-making films. Star Wars is just, killing everything around it, and so he comes aboard. David Lynch comes aboard. He's a young man, and he has a big talent search for his lead actor, and he casts an unknown young guy, 25-year-old actor named Kyle MacLachlan. Now, interestingly, if you look at photos of David Lynch from that period and Kyle MacLachlan looks like an idealized younger version of David Lynch. So it's like David Lynch saw someone who looked like his ideal version of himself, and he cast the guy. So it's just a little interesting thing that no one has ever talked about. But Kyle MacLachlan is a very charming actor, and what he lacks in expertise, he definitely is able to play the lead in this film. He's definitely likable and seems smart, and he's dedicated. So they start working on the film, David Lynch's film, and he brings a grotesquerie to it that is off-putting to some critics and some audience members, but he also brings an enormous amount of talent and a remarkable design ability. And so the trick with science fiction, I was just talking to Dave Edison today about this, the trick with any big science fiction movie, particularly an ambitious one, is that it needs to look unlike other science fiction movies. It needs to design and have its own aesthetic. Star Trek certainly does this. Star Wars does it. You wouldn't confuse the two in their design aesthetic. And David Lynch is committed to doing something that looks different, and he succeeds at that. The set design is gorgeous. The costume design, the hair design. There's a lot of really beautiful things in this film. And And also the cast he puts together is phenomenal. He put it's like Brad Dourif, who later would play Wormtongue in the Lord of the Rings films, Jose Ferrer, who won an Oscar playing Cyrano de Bergerac, Virginia Madsen, Richard Jordan, who is the villain in Logan's Run. It just keeps going. I mean, it's Sean Young coming off. Well, she during this period she would also do Blade Runner. Sting is terrific in this film. Max von Sydow. It goes on and on and on. And Dean Stockwell is in it, who was in Twilight Zone and later Battlestar Galactica. Jürgen Prochnow coming off Das Boot. Freddie Jones, who's a wonderful British character actor. Sean Phillips, who played Livia in the miniseries of I, Claudius. This is a staggeringly great cast of actors, and they really, 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 really deliver. And a young actor not too well known at that time, Patrick Stewart, before Star Trek The Next Generation. So again, it looks great. The acting is really solid. But the problem that David Lynch encounters is the same one that Jodorowsky encountered, which is suddenly the studio is insisting that the runtime be no more than 2 hours. And David Lynch knows that that's going to eviscerate the film. So, and by the way, to save money, Dino De Laurentiis shot it in Mexico, and he shot it together with Conan the Destroyer as though they were one production, you know, so for the costs, and so they're reusing stuff and all sorts of things. But they're down in Mexico, and it's a very big production, but also where it really fails badly, is visual effects. Visual effects, he comes from, see, this is after Star Wars and after 2001: A Space Odyssey. The game has changed, but Dino De Laurentiis is coming from the visual effects tradition of Italy and Europe, of really bad-looking visual effects, really funky-looking visual effects. Things like Planet of Blood and you know, all these wacky science fiction movies that Italy was doing, and that's where he's turning for his visual effects. So, but the biggest challenge, of course, is that they've shot a ton of stuff, can't squeeze it down to 2 hours. So finally, the producers make their cut. It's 2 hours long, and as a result, unless you read the book, you are not going to understand what the hell's going on in this movie. They stick a narration on the front of it with Virginia Madsen, but people are kind of just, totally lost watching it. And to the degree that the first week the movie comes out, they hand people, everyone who goes to see the movie gets a sheet that gives a glossary of terms and who everyone is, just so they're not as confused. But even so, the critics are very down on the film. The audience, it's a financial failure. Like, it cost I think it was $30 or $40 million to make it, and I think it was $30 million to make it, and only made $40 million, and so that's considered a failure. And yet, there was the sense of something of a lost opportunity. There's some wonderful moments, and so then. By then, they realized that they could, for the TV release, they could, because miniseries had been thriving by this point. We're talking, the movie comes out in 1984, and there were toys, including this one of Sting as Fade Harkonnen. See? Pretty cool. And Sting looks great. He's in amazing shape in this movie, and he's very striking. So for the TV release, they realized they could make it longer. But again, by now David Lynch is totally bummed out. His vision has not been realized, and he moves on. He had been writing Blue Velvet before that, and he moves on to shoot Blue Velvet. Comes out in 1986, and that's the quintessential David Lynch film. It's a huge success, and he brought some of the Dune actors with him. So he has Dean Stockwell in it. He has Kyle MacLachlan in it, who becomes one of his major actors moving forward in things like Twin Peaks. But when they come to, they say, well, we can expand this for the TV edition. Rafaela De Laurentiis, the producer, Dino De Laurentiis' daughter, is the one who is tasked with making the longer version. So she puts almost an hour of material in, but it's really wacky, and it's not done with an artist's eye, and it opens with this terrible male narration done by a man with this really bad concept art or whatever the hell it was, illustrations. It's just really a bad opening. And so here is the original Blu-ray of the theatrical release of Dune, and you can see, cool looking. And then when the TV version came out, I'd heard about it, so at a science fiction convention I was able to buy a bootleg of the TV version, which has almost an hour of additional material. But again, you couldn't really recommend this one because of all of its wackiness, or this one because of what was truncated. So, what to do? So it turns out that a fan who goes by the name of Spice Diver found out that all these different releases around the world were, releasing different scenes as added bonuses. Now, also, I should say that David Lynch was so bummed out that when they released the TV version, the hour-long version, he put Alan Smithy as a pseudonym as director. Alan Smithy is the pseudonym that every director in the Directors Guild uses when the movie is a disaster. And for his writing pseudonym, he used Judas Booth. So it's Judas Iscariot, of course, and John Wilkes Booth. So two famous assassins. So it's like, this was just murdered. So that's how bummed out he is. But over the years, people start to notice that this is a really cool film. It's got many great things. They start to long to sort of see the long version, sort of the director's cut that should have been. But of course, David Lynch has moved on. He has no interest in going back to Dune. Now, recently, interestingly enough, they just came out with this, which is the 4K restoration of the theatrical release of Dune. And this is gorgeous. And 4K, they went back to the original 35mm negative. They restored the film to all of its glory. It's gorgeous. So, but as I was starting to say, at the same time, now Dune is gathering a lot of fans and a lot of people who really like the movie. And so and YouTube starts to emerge as an alternative source of content, and the fan conventions start to emerge, the science fiction conventions where you can show fan films, because kids are doing Star Wars fan films and Star Trek fan films. And this guy who goes by the name of Spice Diver, man or woman, goes by the name of Spice Diver, decides to put together their own version of Dune, the ultimate version of Dune, that includes all the scenes that were jettisoned that were on all these different releases around the world as extras. And he does 3 versions over a period of years to get to the ultimate version. And what we're going to do in a few minutes is we're going to show you that ultimate version of David Lynch's Dune. And until we get a director's cut, this is going to be the most complete version. But the cool part is there are wonderful scenes and wonderful acting, and the scenes clear up all the confusion so you understand what's going on. There's still problems. The romance with with Sean Young is very, very perfunctory, and you don't know who she is or why they fall in love or any of that. The battle scenes are kind of a little strange and could be choreographed better. But that said, this version, which is, as I said, an hour longer, it's 3 hours, is as good as we're going to get at this point. I think I applaud Spice Diver for all of the effort. It's wonderful to see all these scenes that I'd never seen before, and it's done with such love and such care. And so we're going to show that in a minute. But I want to talk about the Dune, the life of Dune since David Lynch, because we've talked about all the things that happened before David Lynch. Now, of course, David Lynch went on, thankfully, to have a great career, which is still continuing. He's one of the great filmmakers of all time. No two ways about that. But for Dune itself, Frank Herbert had a much, much larger vision than just one novel. So when the first novel was successful and put him on the map, he wrote 3 novels, two further novels, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, that formed a trilogy of the first 3 books and told kind of a story that was, contained. And then he wrote 6 more after that. 3 more after that, a total of 6 books. Now, one of the things that was very, very interesting about Dune was that the first novel is only the first half of the story that Frank Herbert wanted to tell, because he had worked as a speechwriter, and he had, during the 50s, and he was very concerned about charismatic leaders and where they might take their followers, what might emerge, what atrocities might happen with people falling in love with a charismatic, heroic-seeming figure. And John Kennedy was the one who started his mind thinking along this way. And so, while the first novel charts the rise of this heroic figure in a very much kind of a standard storytelling Hollywood kind of hero version, the other side of that first trilogy was about how that can get totally out of hand and lead to terrible things, and how do you then puncture the myth of the savior, of the Messiah in this case, Paul Atreides to get a government and a leadership that cares about the people and is responsive to the people. It's a very interesting structure, to the degree that the sequel novels, some people really didn't like them because they wanted the further adventures of Paul Atreides, Paul Muad'Dib, as a heroic figure, and that was not where Frank Herbert was going with it. So he was actually creating a much more interesting and much deeper and more profound examination of this than you would think just reading the first book. So now we've got all of this, and after writing the first 6 Dune novels, Frank Herbert, by the way, through that period was a huge, wealthy, famous science fiction writer who would punch through, not just in the science fiction world, but to the larger mainstream as well. And he would write other books too, and they'd be rolled out, with all the bells and whistles and the fanfare, but they never had the impact that Dune had. Dune, as a continuing property, intellectual property, was the one. It's the one that made him. And so he wrote 6 books. He had written extensive background material. And while he was writing the 7th book, he passed away. And his son, Brian, and my friend Kevin J. Anderson decided, because there was so much material in the files that had Frank Herbert been able to keep going, he would have written about, they decided to continue writing the books. And so they've written a number of Dune sequels. This is one of them, the Butlerian Jihad. And here is their signatures. And they're dear, dear souls. Kevin J. Anderson is a great guy. And eventually, someday, I may even work with him myself. But he, and they went on to success. And some people love them, and some people think they're not as good as the original Frank Herbert novels. Dealer, you take your choice, But so they're continuing to be made. Dune is still popular. Dune is still selling in graphic novels, comic books, all of this stuff. So the Sci-Fi Channel during this time, throughout these decades, has been there's now a cable channel for science fiction, Sci-Fi, and they decide to greenlight a Dune miniseries, and so that comes out, and it's got some very strange design work. It's very weird headdresses, and some of the casting is strong, some of it not. The actor playing Dune, Paul Atreides, is a little bit white bread, and so it's not as strong as the potential of David Lynch's version, but it does tell a coherent story over something like 6 hours. And so it's a success. So then they do something that no one has done prior to this, which is to greenlight a filmed adaptation of the 2nd and 3rd books. And they're kind of pushed together into Children of Dune, the miniseries. And this is made amazingly well. It's a wonderful miniseries. I just watched it, and this is the Blu-ray, which I highly recommend. And the amazing thing is, every now and then, those of us who work in film and TV will cast a young unknown or someone who's on the rise who later becomes a star, but who has all of the amazing brilliance already in place when we cast them before they're well known. And that's what Children of Dune managed to do. They cast, as the son of Paul Atreides, they cast James McAvoy, and he's great in this. And they also had Alex Kriega playing his mother, Jessica, in this, and she's great. She would also be seen in First Contact, Star Trek First Contact, as the Borg Queen. So she's a wonderful, wonderful actress. And Susan Sarandon is in it, playing sort of a mustache-twirling Harkonnen kind of villainous character. And so she's not really able to bring much to the role, but it's Susan Sarandon, so, it's nice to see her. And Ian McNeice plays the Baron Harkonnen in both the Dune miniseries and in this. And he's an actor, he's a heavyset actor that I've always loved. I saw him first in Nicholas Nickleby, the Royal Shakespeare Company version of that with Roger Rees, and he's great in that. And he's also the town crier in the Rome TV series on HBO. And so he's just he's one of those actors who's not hugely well known, but I always look for him and I always enjoy seeing him. And interestingly enough, the actor who played Paul Atreides comes back in the second one, but because he gets to kind of have a lot of stuff happen to him and become a little more of a wild-eyed, crazy prophet, he's able to link onto that, and his performance is much more interesting in this film. So I highly recommend Children of Dune. And but then, of course, we get. And, oh, by the way, some of the other actors. There's Stephen Burkhoff playing Stilgar in the Children of Dune. He's a very strong, very noticeable actor. He's been in a lot of stuff, and he's really, 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 really good. And but Alec Newman, by the way, is the one who plays Paul in this. And so that came out. So the miniseries of Dune came out in 2000. The Children of Dune came out in 2003. So we've got like 14 years since we've seen a dramatization of Dune. But a lot has happened since then in the world and in how media is perceived and released and viewed. And as I said, movies and TV are metamorphosizing into each other and becoming one thing. So, Denis Villeneuve. We get to Denis Villeneuve. Now, he, of course, is the wonderful director of The Arrival and Blade Runner 2049, which is a film I very much like. He has a terrific visual sense. So, and he loved the David Lynch Dune. He recognized, like I do, that it was a work of great, great merit that doesn't completely succeed, but has many, many joys to offer. So Denis Villeneuve comes aboard, and he shoots his version of Dune, and next month it comes out. So it's got a great cast. Timothée Chalamet as Paul Atreides, Zendaya, Rebecca Ferguson, Oscar Isaac, Dave Bautista, Jason Momoa, Stellan Skarsgård, Josh Brolin, Charlotte Rampling, Javier Bardem. So it's got a solid and an amazing cast, just like David Lynch's did. So hopefully it will be great. Hopefully it'll be the version of Dune we've all waited for and longed for. And he's already shooting the sequel, so this could become a franchise. Because what Dino De Laurentiis wanted way back when with David Lynch was he described Dune as Star Wars for adults. But the problem with that, just like when they were going to do the Golden Compass and thinking it was another Harry Potter, it's not, because it's such a dense world that it creates, such a dense universe that it needs a big canvas. You cannot get that all across in 2 hours, and that's why the movie of the Golden Compass failed, even though it was gorgeous and had a great cast. And it would wait until becoming a TV series to where you could say, okay, now I get what's going on, without reading the novels. I, of course, have read them, but Dune was the same way. But so now, Dune will be a longer length, which is great. It'll be an IMAX. It's going to look terrific. The cast is spectacular, and and it'll lead to a sequel. And supposedly Denis Villeneuve has only written the first half. The first Dune movie is only the first half of the story. We'll see if that's true. But if it's true, that's fine, because then people will wait for the next one, and they'll be getting the story in a pace and a length that will make it cohesive and understandable, and that's all to the good, because not everyone reads the book. Now, I can recommend the book highly. It's this here. We go back to the original, the hardcover original release Dune, the first edition. And the audiobooks are there too, and they're good as well. There's a variety of versions you can get on Audible. But eventually, in a month, when the Villeneuve Dune comes out, you will hear from me. I will review it, of course, as Mr. Sci-Fi. But in the meantime, I really love the David Lynch version. I really love what it has in it, despite its weaknesses, despite its flaws. There are many, many, many lovely, lovely things in it, wonderful things in it, delights to be had. So what I recommend you do is, in a moment, we're going to show you the entire 3-hour Spice Diver cut, the definitive, as far as we have till now, version of David Lynch's adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune. And then what I suggest you do, if you like it, is then buy the 4K of the 2-hour version and really see all the details, all the visual beauty that this version has. So I've talked long enough, God knows, and so we've taken this long journey. Frank Herbert, I think, will be pleased with how many people of great talent have tried to tell his story. And of course, as a novelist, he was able to tell his own story quite well and quite thoroughly. So that's about it for now, but without any more delay. Well, looks like there's going to be a bit of a delay, because when I posted this video with the entire movie, the Spice Diver cut of David Lynch's Dune, they flagged it and they took it off of most countries' YouTube feeds. So we're going to have to come up with an alternative. So here's what I suggest, guys. The Spice Diver Redux cut, the complete cut that Spice Diver did, here's the link to it, and you can go there and watch the entire David Lynch version as edited by Spice Diver, and 3 cheers for Spice Diver. If for any reason that link is gone, then go to Google and just type in Dune Redux Spice Diver, and you may be able to find it nosing around. So, but sorry about that. But again, the complete Dune story, the complete history of Dune, we're able to present that. and again, we'll all see the Denis Villeneuve version in a few weeks in October, and see what we think, and we'll talk about that. And again, Mr. Sci-Fi, I'm doing my Twilight Zone minutes and all of that stuff. You can go to twilightzoncommentaries.com for more information about all of that. And but that's about it. So from the wonderful world of science fiction, I bid you a a fond adieu for now. And but definitely go to Spice Diver's mix of David Lynch's Dune. It's very much worth watching. And that's it for now, guys. Talk to you soon.